We've been taught to look at the 20th century from a certain way. Actually, we've been taught to look at the 20th century from one major player in the 20th century, the West or the US. That's a perspective that we have. But what would be an objective perspective on the 20th century? The 20th century starts with the Russian Revolution. It's the short century. Short 20th century. It lasts from 1917 to 1989 when the Soviet Union collapses. First East Germany and then 1991 in Russia. The socialist experiment was a colossal failure on many levels, but we must remember that it was an attempt. What was it an attempt to do? It was an attempt to free the majority of humanity. Free the majority of humanity from capitalism and from imperialism. That was what was Marxist Leninism in the 20th century. An attempt to free workers from their bosses and an attempt to free subjected people from colonialists. And that's the way in which most activists and intellectuals and leftist politicians understood Marxist-Leninism throughout the 20th century. This project failed, though it was a worthy project to free humanity. It first failed in Russia in the sense that instead of worker ownership over the means of production, worker ownership over factories, we had party ownership over factories, party ownership over the means of production. So the failure already began in Soviet Russia. Of course, it became even worse when Lenin died and Stalin came to power. The Bolshevik Revolution also generated a reaction from the whole world, and one of the most virulent reaction was National Socialism, was Nazism. Nazism is not, we shouldn't think about Nazism as a totalitarian ideology, first and foremost, but we have to think about it as an anti-socialist. Socialism was the enemy of the Nazis. Jews were the scapegoats, or they always talked about Judeo-Bolshevism. That was the enemy that the Nazis articulated. So that was a virulent reaction to that force, that emancipatory force of humanity. World War II, in a sense, is not that different from World War I. The Nazism was a novel response to Bolshevism. It was a response that took some aspects of socialism, for example, mass mobilization. But the core was racism and imperialism. And in that sense, Nazism was not that different from imperialism in the past, from European powers, from English, for example, imperialism. So World War II is a battle between two empires and two racist empires, essentially. German racist empire and an American racist empire. You have to remember that in America, at the time of World War II, you had Jim Crow laws in the South. You had laws against intermarriage between blacks and whites. So America was a deeply racist country at the time. And when it fought Nazism, it wasn't an anti-racist country. It presented itself in this way. It needed an ideological weapon against the Nazis, and it used Nazi racism as a weapon. But essentially, we're talking about two empires. And the reason that America went to war against Germany is not because Germany was anti-Semitic or racist, but because Germany was a rival empire that needed to be contained and crushed. And that's what happened. A rival empire was contained and crushed, and then the major force of human emancipation, Marxist-Leninism, sort of failed and slowly dissipated. Its only achievement ultimately was decolonization of the third world, which we should not discount, but that's the major achievement. So the end of the 20th century ends not with a bang like the beginning, but with a whimper. Not the end of history, but a sort of lull after an attempt, a failed attempt, a progressively failed attempt to free humanity that began with a bang.